Welcome to Midnight Terrors, where spine-chilling tales come to life. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications. You don't want to miss a single story that'll keep you up at night. We're on a mission to grow, and your support is everything. Share these terrifying stories with your friends, family, and anyone who dares to listen. Thanks for being part of the journey. Let's begin. It was an ordinary Thursday night at St. Strength, Evangeline's hospital, a 200-year-old institution that bore the weight of countless tragedies. Rumors of hauntings weren't uncommon among the staff, but most brushed them off as folklore. Clara Martinez, a 28-year-old nurse, clocked in for her shift in the intensive care unit, ICU. The weather outside was cold and unrelenting. Rain lashed against the windows, drowning out any sounds from the city below. Quiet night so far, Clara remarked to her colleague Megan, who gave her a skeptical glance. "Don't jinx it," Megan replied. "ICU nights are never quiet for long." The clock ticked on uneventfully until 2:13 a.m. when Clara received a call from the ER. "We're transferring a critical patient to you," the voice on the other line said. "Room 307. Room 307 was at the far end of the ICU hallway, a room often joked about among the staff for its eerie atmosphere. Patients placed there frequently reported unsettling visions, shadowy figures lurking in corners, strange whispers, and the sensation of being watched. The room had been vacant for weeks after the last occupant had died under mysterious circumstances. Clara reluctantly prepared the room, muttering under her breath, "Great, just what I need." The patient, an elderly man in his late 70s, was wheeled into the ICU on a gurney. His chart identified him as Samuel Holt, admitted for severe respiratory distress and hallucinations. His eyes darted around wildly, and he muttered incoherently as the transport team settled him into the bed. As Clara adjusted his oxygen mask, Samuel grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "Don't let them take me," he rasped, his pale blue eyes wide with terror. "Take you where?" Clara asked, startled. "The shadows. They're waiting," Samuel whispered before releasing her and falling into a restless sleep. Clara tried to shake off the encounter, chalking it up to delirium. But when she turned to leave, she noticed something peculiar. The room was unnaturally cold, and her breath formed visible puffs in the air. Checking the thermostat, she saw it was set to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Yet it felt like the dead of winter inside. By 3:30 a.m., the hospital had settled into an eerie stillness, the kind that made every creak and whisper feel amplified. Clara sat at the nurse's station, absently clicking her pen, her mind clouded with fatigue. That's when room 307's call light blinked on. She glanced at the monitor, expecting the usual, a patient needing assistance or adjusting their position. But this wasn't normal. Samuel Holt, the patient in 307, was sitting upright in bed, his eyes locked on the security camera with an unnerving intensity. Clara froze for a moment. His face seemed off. Was it the shadows, or was something truly unsettling in his expression? She shook off the chill creeping up her spine, grabbed her stethoscope, and headed toward the room. The hallway stretched out before her, dimly lit, with the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. One light flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the walls. As she neared room 307, the air felt heavier, colder even. "Mr. Holt," Clara called softly, pushing the door open. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Samuel was still sitting up, his head slightly tilted, lips moving in an inaudible chant. His eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. "Mr. Holt, are you feeling all right?" Clara stepped closer, trying to steady her voice, though her unease was mounting. Suddenly, Samuel's head snapped to face her, his eyes dark and unfamiliar. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was deep, guttural, and full of malice. "You shouldn't have come here." Clara's breath hitched, and she stumbled backward, nearly dropping her stethoscope. Her heart pounded as her mind raced to make sense of what was happening. Before she could respond, the room plunged into total darkness. The silence was suffocating. Then came a faint, low growl that seemed to come from all around her. "Samuel?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The lights flickered back on, casting harsh, sterile brightness into the room. Samuel was lying flat on his bed as if he'd never moved. His chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep, his face calm, almost serene. Clara stood frozen, her eyes darting between him and the shadows that seemed to linger unnaturally long in the corners of the room. Was it her imagination, or had she heard faint whispers in those few seconds of darkness? Her pulse still raced as she backed out of the room, unwilling to turn her back on Samuel. She made her way back to the nurse's station, glancing over her shoulder every few steps. When she checked the monitor again, Samuel was lying just as he had been, but something was different. The camera feed glitched for a moment, and for the briefest second, she thought she saw a dark figure standing at the foot of his bed. The figure wasn't there when the feed returned to normal, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Clara wasted no time reporting the incident to Megan and the night supervisor, but her words were met with dismissive glances and patronizing smiles. "You've been working too many shifts," Megan said, patting her on the shoulder. "Your mind's just playing tricks on you." Clara wanted to argue, but how could she explain the cold grip of fear that still lingered, or the way Samuel's voice echoed in her ears? The supervisor's nonchalance only deepened her unease. She resolved to keep an extra close eye on room 307. But the room didn't make it easy for her. The monitors began glitching periodically, displaying spikes and dips in Samuel's vitals that didn't match his condition. It was as if the machinery itself was being tampered with, or protesting against something unseen. By 4:12 a.m., the heart monitor let out a piercing alarm. The line was flat. Clara and Megan bolted into the room, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Samuel lay motionless, his face contorted in an expression so haunting it made Clara's stomach churn. She dropped to her knees and began chest compressions. "Come on, Samuel. Stay with me," she muttered, her voice trembling. Megan moved to grab the defibrillator, but before she could power it up, Samuel's eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of a man who'd just been resuscitated. They were wide with unbridled fear, darting wildly as if he could see something they couldn't. "They're here," he rasped, his voice barely audible. His trembling hand shot up, pointing shakily to the far corner of the room. Clara and Megan turned instinctively, their eyes straining against the dim light. The corner looked empty at first, but then it shifted. The shadows seemed to thicken, curling and writhing unnaturally, as if alive. The temperature plummeted without warning. Clara's breath came out in visible puffs, and a violent shiver ran down her spine. The lights flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows across the walls. Then came the voice, deep, guttural, and inhuman, "Leave him to us." The sound wrapped around Clara like a cold, suffocating fog, rooting her to the spot. Megan screamed, stumbling backward until she hit the doorframe. "I'm not staying here," she cried, bolting from the room without a second thought. Clara couldn't move. Her feet felt like lead as her wide eyes locked onto the corner. From the writhing darkness emerged a figure, or what could barely be called one. It was humanoid, but grotesquely so. Its limbs were unnaturally long and spindly, and its head tilted unnaturally, as if it were examining her. Where its eyes should have been were dark, gaping voids that seemed to pull at the edges of reality. Samuel's grip tightened around Clara's hand, snapping her out of her trance. "Help me," he whimpered, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. His voice was small, desperate, a stark contrast to the looming terror in the corner. Clara swallowed hard, her instincts as a nurse overriding her terror. "You're safe," she lied, squeezing his hand. Her voice shook, betraying the words she was trying to convince herself were true. The shadow moved closer, its presence filling the room like an oppressive weight. The lights flickered violently, casting the creature's grotesque silhouette onto the walls, stretching and contorting. The guttural whisper returned, louder this time, overlapping with itself as if multiple voices spoke in unison. "You cannot save him," it hissed. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears, but she refused to let go of Samuel's hand. "I won't leave you," she whispered, though her voice trembled with the lie. The figure's head snapped toward her, its void-like eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, Clara felt as if it were looking directly into her soul, pulling at the darkest corners of her mind. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Suddenly, Samuel's grip slackened. His eyes rolled back and his body went limp. The shadow halted its advance, retreating slightly as if its task was done. Clara's heart clenched in panic. "No, stay with me, Samuel," she shouted, shaking him. The guttural voice returned, low and mocking. "He is ours." Clara felt hot tears streaking her cheeks, her fear giving way to frustration and helplessness. She refused to let go, even as the shadow began to dissipate, fading back into the corner. It lingered there, its presence still palpable, as if it were watching and waiting for its next move. When Samuel's chest rose faintly, Clara sobbed in relief. The monitors blinked back to life, displaying weak but steady vitals. The oppressive cold began to lift and the light steadied. But the shadow never truly disappeared. It remained in the corner, a silent reminder that whatever had come for Samuel wasn't finished. And deep down, Clara knew the nightmare was far from over. Determined to save Samuel, Clara threw herself into finding answers. She immediately started looking at his medical records in the hospital archives. The fluorescent lights hummed softly as her fingers flipped through faded pages, and a sense of unease settled over her. The deeper she dug, the darker the story became. She discovered a chilling piece of Samuel's past. Decades ago, he had been a patient at this very hospital, but not in a standard ward. Samuel had been institutionalized in the psychiatric wing of St. Evangeline's after claiming to see dark beings that tormented the dying. The notes in his file were sparse but unnervingly detailed, penned by a Dr. Howard Green, who described Samuel as disturbingly lucid in his accounts of the unseen. But it wasn't just Samuel's claims that sent chills down Clara's spine. It was the records of the psychiatric wing itself. Her eyes widened as she stumbled upon a report from 1973 detailing an infamous incident that had been buried beneath layers of hospital history. A mass death had occurred in the psychiatric ward during Samuel's admission. According to the documents, every patient in the ward had died within a single night. Nurses and doctors reported hearing blood-curdling screams echoing through the halls and witnessing unnatural shadows creeping along the walls. Some had tried to enter the ward, but the doors wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding them shut. By morning, when the ward was finally breached, the scene was described as unspeakable. Patients were found lifeless, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. Samuel, however, had been discovered unharmed, huddled in a corner, muttering over and over, "They took them all." The psychiatric wing had been sealed off immediately after the incident. No one spoke of it, and over time, the story faded into the hospital's shadows. But Samuel had been released months later, deemed stable, though his warnings about the dark beings persisted. Clara's breath quickened as she pieced it together. Whatever had tormented Samuel back then had followed him here. Her mind raced as she stared at the grainy black-and-white photo attached to the 1973 report. It showed the door to the psychiatric wing, its glass window shattered, with faint, shadowy impressions staining the floor, a sight that looked eerily similar to the shadows she had seen in Samuel's room. Her hands trembled as she closed the folder, but a question gnawed at her. Why had the shadows returned now, and why Samuel? Determined to find answers, she sought out the hospital's oldest staff member, Martha, a retired nurse who had worked at St. Evangeline's for over 4 decades. Clara found her in the staff lounge, sipping tea and flipping through an old book. When Clara mentioned Samuel's name, Martha froze. "I remember him," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was just a boy back then, quiet, sweet, but the things he saw—" She trailed off, her eyes clouding with memory. "What happened that night in 1973? Clara pressed. Martha's lips quivered. "It wasn't a fire or gas leak like they claimed," she said. "We knew it was something unnatural. I saw the shadows myself. They moved like they had a mind of their own. And the whispers, they called out to us, Clara. They wanted more than the patients. They wanted anyone who dared come near." Clara felt her stomach twist. "Why didn't anyone stop it?" Martha shook her head. "You can't stop what you don't understand. After that night, the ward was sealed, and we all agreed to forget it ever happened. But those things, they don't just go away. They lie dormant, waiting for the right moment." "The right moment?" Clara asked, dread settling in her chest. "Someone must have triggered them," Martha said. "Samuel was their anchor back then. If he's here now, they're not finished with him." Clara's heart sank. The whispers, the flickering lights, the freezing cold, it all made sense now. Whatever was haunting Samuel wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was ancient. And worse, it was spreading. The thought sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She realized she wasn't just fighting to save Samuel, she was fighting to contain something that had the power to consume them all. As the clock struck 5 a.m., the tension in the air thickened, almost suffocating. Samuel's monitors began blaring in unison. His heart rate spiked erratically, the numbers on the screen jumping like a countdown to something inevitable. His body convulsed violently, and his once hoarse murmurs escalated into gut-wrenching screams that echoed down the dark, sterile hallway. Clara and Megan rushed into the room, their adrenaline surging as they tried to stabilize him. But the second they stepped inside, a suffocating chill enveloped them. The shadow was back, larger and darker than ever before, looming over Samuel's trembling body. Its form was more defined now, an unnaturally tall, humanoid shape with limbs that seemed to stretch unnervingly long, almost touching the ceiling. Its hollow, cavernous eyes glowed faintly with an eerie light, locking onto Clara as if it had been waiting for her. Clara's legs felt like lead, but something inside her stirred, an instinct to protect Samuel, no matter what. "Leave him alone," she shouted, her voice trembling but defiant. The figure paused, its form flickering as though caught between this world and another. It tilted its head unnaturally to one side, the movement sharp and deliberate, like it was studying her. Then the room fell eerily silent. Even the machines that had been blaring moments ago went completely still. When the shadow spoke, its voice was not one but many, a cacophony of whispers and guttural growls that made Clara's stomach churn. "You can't save him," it hissed, the words dripping with malice. The temperature in the room plummeted further, frost forming on the windows and creeping up the walls. Clara's breath came out in visible puffs as her heart raced. Megan clung to the wall, frozen in fear, her eyes wide and unblinking. Suddenly the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, swallowing every trace of visibility. Clara felt her way toward Samuel's bed, her hand outstretched, but the air around her seemed heavier, resisting her movements. Then came the sound, soft at first, like the distant hum of wind, but growing louder and more dissonant. It was a mix of anguished screams, sinister laughter, and a low, ominous chant that seemed to vibrate through the room. Clara wanted to cover her ears, but she couldn't bring herself to move. When the lights flickered back on, Clara's stomach dropped. Samuel's bed was empty. The crisp, white sheets were undisturbed, as if he had vanished into thin air. The monitors were flatlined, their screens casting an eerie glow in the dim room. "No, no, no, no," Clara muttered, her voice cracking as she frantically searched the room. She spun around, her eyes darting to every corner, but Samuel was nowhere to be found. Samuel Holt's disappearance was never explained. The hospital documented his case as an unexplained patient transfer error, but Clara knew the truth. The shadows had taken him. She quit her job at St. Evangeline soon after, unable to shake the feeling that she, too, was being watched. To this day, room 307 remains sealed, a cold spot in the otherwise bustling hospital. And every so often, staff report hearing whispers in the empty hallways, asking for help that never comes.